Good afternoon. Welcome so much to all of you for taking the time to come out today to listen to Dr. Graham Rowles. He is the founder of the Graduate Center for Gerontology at the University of Kentucky. His joys in life are gardening, soccer, so forth, and his greatest academic achievement is having me as a student. Just kidding. You know how to do that.
No. The greatest academic challenge.
Challenge.
Right.
So I don't want to take away much time for his presentation time. So we're going to go ahead and get started. And let's give a round of applause welcoming Dr. Rowles.
Great. Julie is very wise because she knows that I have a tendency to just go on and on and on and on and on. So, by 7 tonight, I will understand if you feel that you have to leave by 7 tonight. I have a lot that I want to get through. Unfortunately, we have a clock over here. And I want to sort of make a presentation I've been working on quite hard for a while because it was a surprise when it turned out that I discovered what I was supposed to be doing here today. And it challenged me in some really interesting ways. So let me go through this, and I have a bunch of slides to show, so I'm hoping that I don't flash through them too fast for you. And certainly I'd be willing to answer questions afterwards and hopefully leave some time for questions after this. My talk is called Growing Old in Rural Appalachia, Looking Back and Thinking Forward. When I first moved to Appalachia, in 1976 to become a faculty member at West Virginia University, among the first articles that I read were 2 contributions by anthropologist John Lozier and sociologist Ronald Althouse, who had spent time studying the experience of older adults in a small rural community. The articles, Retirement to the Porch in Rural Appalachia and Social Enforcement of Behavior Toward Older Adults in an Appalachian Mountain Settlement, described how old people in this community had, over their lives, accumulated a large amount of social capital as a result of their exemplary, although unspectacular lives that they had led. As they had grown older, this social capital enabled them to count on support from neighbors, indeed from the entire community. The support of elders was an unquestioned community obligation and expectation. This high level of social embeddedness in the community and the social support it generated provided a buffer to the objective poverty that many residents of the community were experiencing in their old age. Reading these works was inspirational. It reinforced my desire to explore the lives of older adults in the region, something I've now been doing on an on and off basis for close to 40 years. In my presentation today, I want to share glimpses of insight that have resulted from this journey. In a very, very real sense, they are fragments derived from a series of projects, some of them ethnographic, some involving the analysis of secondary data, some emanating from research on policy issues, and at times I've been heavily involved directly through working in the region. At other times, I've observed from a distance. My hope is to provide insight into the way in which growing old in Appalachia may be evolving as a result of changing circumstances in the region. No one can represent the diversity of Appalachia. So it's important for me to emphasize that what I will present is only one way of trying to assemble the fragments into a coherent picture. Let me start by outlining what I hope to share in the process of looking back with a view to thinking forward. My talk is organized in 6 parts. First, I look at the aging of Appalachia as represented in a series of maps produced by my colleague, Aaron Guest. Second, I establish a baseline for considering transitions in the lived experience of growing old in the region by revisiting an ethnographic study completed more than 4 decades ago on growing old in Colton, a rural Appalachian community of 400 residents. Here, the objective was to reveal dimensions of what enabled the older residents of this community to maintain remarkably high levels of life satisfaction and well-being in the face of poverty and objectively poor living circumstances. Third, I document the changing pattern of poverty among older adults since the time of my original study. I illustrate how poverty among older adults has become more localized and has remained endemic and persistent to intervention in a few regions, especially eastern Kentucky. I then focus on the current circumstances of older adults in this part of Appalachia. At this point, emphasis shifts to thinking forward as I consider some of the challenges and socioeconomic transitions that are making this part of Appalachia a completely different setting for growing old than it was a generation ago. To grow old in eastern Kentucky has to become to grow old in a setting pervaded by hopelessness and despair. I conclude with observations on how possible pathways to a future that, while not denying the need for basic structural and economic change to address the root causes of poverty, builds on some of the strengths of social engagement and place integration that I discovered in Colton so many years ago. First, let's consider the aging of Appalachia. Appalachia is growing older. When I first began my research in the region in the late 1970s, the proportion of older adults in many counties within the region was already well above the national average. Note the number of counties with more than 14% of their population 65 years of age and older. And in the decades since then, this proportion has increased in each successive decade. By 1990, the number of counties in this category had increased significantly. By 2000, most counties in the region had more than 14% of their population comprised of older adults. Finally, by 2010, very few counties in the region had elderly population concentrations of less than 14%. Indeed, in the majority of the counties in the region, more than 18% of the population comprised older adults. The aging of Appalachia represents a combination of demographic processes. In part, it reflects aging in place. To a significant extent, it reflects patterns of significant outmigration of the young. And in a few places, increasing percentage of older adults reflect in-migration, primarily return migration of people who left in search of jobs but have returned home to retire. So what was it like to grow old in the region? And how have the circumstances of aging changed in this region? In establishing a baseline, let me take you back in time. During the 1980s, early 1980s, I spent 3 years trying to understand the experience of a panel of 15 older people living in Colton, a former coal mining and railroad community of 403 persons nestled in the mountains of West Virginia. This population had declined from a peak of 800 in 1920, when many of the participants in my research were young and still engaged in Appalachia and in this community. As with many Appalachian communities, the physical landscape provided stark images of the consequences of poverty and economic decline. Colton was no exception. And some of you from this region are familiar with these kinds of images. This was the view in winter in 1980. Okay. Fairly desolate place in some respects, at least to the outsider. My work involved in living in Colton in the community for 3 months each summer and visits to spend the day in the community for 2 days every week for the rest of each year. During the fieldwork, I got to know my participants very well. In addition to gaining insight into their lives, the lives of other older adults in the community, and the pace of life in the community, I ate with the participants, I worshiped with them, and I became familiar with the details of their lives, all of the details of their lives. They also got to know me. My son Darren was born while we were living in Colton. Not long after his birth, the participants in my study presented us with a quilt that they'd been making, unbeknownst to me. And as he grew up, my son Darren had multiple grandmothers. Most of these individuals were living on a very limited incomes. But surprisingly, their level of life satisfaction was extremely high. Similar to Lozier and Althouse, I found that living in this community was a very different experience that might appear to outsiders passing through and simply viewing the physical landscape. There was a culture of growing old in Colton that acted as a buffer to the worst aspects of objective poverty. To grow old in Colton was to be immersed in a lifestyle and achieve a level of place integration. And you'll hear that word again, integration in place. That was remarkable. A key theme to emerge was the concept of insideness, being inside this place, that existed on three primary levels. First was a physical insideness in this environment that resulted from the repetitive rhythm and routine of daily life. Mary, for example, had a daily routine of traveling to the post office, then the Colton store, then the senior center. She avoided the most direct route because she was fearful of a large dog that would rush to the fence of his yard and bark at her if she went that route. And she was afraid of slipping on a steep and deeply rutted incline. I discovered that most of the residents of the community followed a comparable daily routine. That rarely took them beyond the bounds of the immediate community. These are the pathways traced by Lucinda during a single week. Notice, and this is important, how key locations that orient her life are the Colton store, the post office, the senior center, and her church. So you can imagine the rhythm and routine of lots of older adults in this community following pathways within the community that are pathways that actually intersect with each other and give a sense of belonging and physical identification with this place. For the women, these daily pathways all seem to converge and focus on the senior center. So think about life here and think about how life is engaged in terms of these activities of being part of this community. Now, the men were very different. For the men, the focus of daily routines was different. For many, it focused on a daily ritual of picking up the mail. Of course, on most days, there was no mail to pick up. However, each morning at around 10 a.m., they would walk or drive to the trailer that was the post office, and then on to the Colton store next door, where they would convene on the bench outside. Physical insideness in Colton was complemented by a sense of social insideness within the community that resulted from the development over many decades of a mutually supportive society of the old, in which each older adult was embraced and played a role. Beatrice was the historian. If you wanted to know anything about somebody who died, you asked Beatrice. Frances was a former school teacher who organized all the activities and prevailed on me to make sure that the words for songs were copied on the Xerox machine that I had back at the university. And Connie, every community has a Connie, was the gossip. You were careful to be discreet in her presence. The focus of social insideness in Colton was the senior center, where the older ladies would convene for quilting and lunch at this congregate meal site. Social insideness for these women also was maintained by an intensively utilized peer telephone network. This slide shows Audrey's telephone calls for a single week, when she spent 11 hours and 55 minutes talking solely to age peers. Note how the majority of the calls are to peers within 800 feet of her home. The primary call beyond this range is to Jennifer Rowles, a person who she saw at the senior center. Each evening, the two ladies discussed events on their favorite soap opera. And one of the things we tried to do was to superimpose for several of the participants the pattern of telephone calls. The problem we had is that it just came out as a black area here as you have the different sets. So think about this with all the 15 people kind of making calls. Certainly social engagement. Now, in contrast, the primary focus for the men's social insideness was the bench outside the Colton store. In contrast to the older women, they rarely used the telephone. In fact, Aisel, one of the people that I work with, had 7 phone calls recorded, because back at that time you were able to record phone calls and do all kinds of stuff. It's 7 each week. And we figured out eventually they were 7 calls, incoming calls that he received from his daughter to check that he was okay. But he would never spontaneously use the phone himself. Now, the social insideness of the men and women integrated and interacted with each other. Because, funnily enough, Mary's pathway down to the Colton store was such that she would actually leave the Colton store and be leaving to go to the senior center at the time when the men were outside sitting on the bench. And so there was a lot of interaction among them, and basically this became part of their daily lives as they cracked jokes with her and they asked her questions, as a whole bunch of things that related to their relationship here. Both physical and social insideness were reinforced by a deep sense of autobiographical insideness within Colton that reflected an intimate lifelong relationship with this community. In an almost literal sense, support and well-being that transcended personal circumstances resulted from being literally a part of this place. Allow me to explain what I'm talking about here. One day, I took a ride down this country road just outside Colton with 87-year-old Bertha. We passed Graveney's cabin, where the slaves used to stay. There was a pond where she swam as a child. Those of you who are more observant may have noticed that Graveney's cabin and the pond are nowhere to be seen. But they remain for Bertha. And they remain literally for Bertha. We passed the tree, and there are millions of trees. The tree from the top of which one of her friends would watch for the dentist as he rode over the hill, and upon spying him, enable all the children to disappear before he arrived in Colton. And there was the crevice, a crevice in this rock, where as a child she had come to collect the rotting leaves that made her mom's flowers grow so good. And there was the trailer, occupying the site of the now removed house where she had been born and raised in a family of 21 children. These illustrations are but a minuscule set of examples of autobiographical affinity with Colton's environmental context. Bertha was a part of this place, and it was part of her. The combination of physical, social, and autobiographical insideness made Colton an especially supportive setting in which to grow old for its lifelong residents. And there are many other themes that relate to this that I could have developed, but we didn't have time to do today. It generated a sense of belonging, a sense of social and environmental support, something that's been called place integration. And it provided a sense of well-being that was a buffer to poverty. Now, having established this as a baseline, a historical baseline of lived experience, let's step back a little. To what extent is the supportive context of Colton, or a Colton, available today for older adults in Appalachia? How have things changed, both with respect to objective poverty and the potential for buffering its worst effects through the kinds of place integration that existed in Colton? Let's begin by looking at trends in poverty among elderly over the past 4 decades. When I was conducting my Colton study, it appeared that President Lyndon Johnson's war on poverty and the efforts of the Appalachian Regional Commission had been little more than a skirmish. Particularly in central and southern Appalachia, poverty rates among persons 65 and older were over 30%, and in some counties still above 50%. And so you ask the question, how have things changed? Well, since then, the situation has gradually improved, at least in terms of this objective indicator. And so we look at 1990, and you see fewer counties in the red. And by 2000, the highest rate of endemic poverty is becoming increasingly localized. And notice how much of it, in terms of these objective data, is focused in eastern Kentucky. And as this slide of the situation in 2010 shows, poverty among the elderly of this region, in contrast to most Appalachia, has remained especially resilient to change. Of course, we're only looking at one measure of poverty here. But let's focus down on eastern Kentucky then. Let's focus down and assess the degree to which the positive aspects of the circumstances I observed in Colton could conceivably exist today within this region. Let's take a few glimpses at eastern Kentucky and what's going on there. In most of eastern Kentucky, particularly in the southeast coal counties, the concentration of older adults is actually, when you look at it, not much higher than the rest of the state, about 15%. Although this is well above state and above national averages. As you know, poverty, at least in these objective terms, has been declining. But that's the distribution of older adults. Now let's look at poverty. As we've already noted, poverty levels remain very high in this region, over 20% in many counties among older adults. And levels of poverty, which haven't shown you here, are much higher for persons over 75 and particularly for older women. And we're dealing in 50% figures here among the oldest. Okay, so now let's shift from looking backwards to looking forwards or thinking forward. When I accepted this assignment, I anticipated that I would be able to embrace the work of contemporary scholars working on studies of growing old in this region. But to my chagrin and surprise, I could find no ethnographic studies of growing old in eastern Kentucky that would allow me to assess the degree to which the levels of place integration and insideness I observed in Colton so many years ago might still be buffering the worst effects of poverty. A few articles gave glimpses of resilience, a phrase or two, of social support networks, and the independent we take care of our own ethos that existed in Colton. But quite frankly, there was not much more than this. There's clearly a need, I would argue, to return to much more in-depth ethnographic research to find out actually is what's going on in the actual experience of older adults' lives in this environment. Now, for decades, we have known about the constraints of rural residence for older adults. There is a virtual litany of abuses and problems that exists in every textbook that's been written, and there's been many of them in the last few decades. In eastern Kentucky, these barriers still remain. Barriers of topography, distance and accessibility, lack of a threshold population to support needed services, limited transportation options, shortages of healthcare professionals, social isolation, and on and on and on. All of these barriers to rural residents. Now, I expected this when I took another look at eastern Kentucky. But what I found was much worse. Contemporary eastern Kentucky is becoming an increasingly hostile rural environment in which to grow old. Discussions with numerous colleagues who have been working in the region recently have presented a highly distressing, indeed depressing picture of a milieu that, although to the outsider looks remarkably similar to Colton, provides a completely different context for the experience of growing old. This is a picture that must be framed in the context of macro demographic and social changes that are devastating this rural region. And I'm going to share something on these, but as we go through, I want you to think about these in terms of their relationship to what it is like to grow old amidst this change as a rural older adult. First is massive outmigration of the young, fueled by the decline of coal as the basis of the economy. Since 2008, coal jobs have dropped from over 14,000 to less than 4,000. With many of its counties already suffering the economic impacts of the tobacco settlement of a few years ago, that reduced demand for a cash crop that provided significant income for many in the most rural counties. The economic and social impacts of the demise of coal have been absolutely devastating. The closing of the mines and resultant outmigration has had significant economic impact. Loss of the coal severance tax has reduced the coffers of most communities. Stores have closed. The Colton store. Senior centers have become less viable. On July 11th last year, the Pike County Senior Citizens Board voted to close down senior centers in Marrowbone and Phelps. The last senior center in Letcher County recently closed. And environmental resources that were conducive to the support of older adults have disappeared. You will recall that the Colton store, the post office, and the senior center were focal resources in the lives of older residents of Colton. A third major factor that has had major impact in Eastern Kentucky as a place to grow old is drugs. The situation is fairly well documented, and it's well summarized in an article that appeared in The Guardian. And contrary to protocol, I'm going to read this, knowing that you can read it for yourself, but I'm still going to read it for impact. This is Karen Jennings, who lives in Beattyville, and you'll see more of Beattyville. I was an alcoholic first. I got drunk and fell in the creek and broke my back. Then I got hooked on the painkillers, the 59-year-old grandmother said. Over the years, Jennings' back healed, but her addiction to powerful opioids remained. After the prescriptions dried up, she was drawn to the underground drug trade that defines Eastern Kentucky today, as coal, oil, and timber once did. Jennings spoke with startling frankness about her part in a plague, gripping the isolated, fading towns dotting this part of Appalachia. Frontier communities steeped in the myth of self-reliance are now blighted by addiction to opioids, hillbilly heroin to those who use them. It's a dependency bound up with the economic despair and financed in part by the same welfare system that is staving up economic collapse across much of Eastern Kentucky. It's a crisis that crosses generations. The magnitude of this problem is well represented, I believe, in recent statistics, indicating that between 2012 and 2015, 14 counties in the region recorded drug overdose death rates of over 39 per 100,000. A secondary effect of this that is highly pertinent to the experience of aging in the region is the effect that this epidemic is having on families. And I thought about including an illustration of a 75-year-old woman who is currently incarcerated for selling drugs, and her children are heavily involved in this as well. Think of what the effects of this kind of environment are in terms of lifestyles. And also, linking back to Colton, on the social order of the community. One of the most significant trends in terms of families and changing families has been a burgeoning phenomenon of grandparents having to raise grandchildren. Although by no means all grandparents raising grandchildren are older adults, many are in their 40s, many find themselves in this situation. A 2014 study in the region indicated that many older adults are caring for these grandchildren whose parents are dealing with drug abuse problems. 57% of them in this situation are incarcerated, 31%, or have died. As my colleague Rebecca Roach, who is completing research on this issue, has shared with me, many older grandparents struggle with the burden of this care. The demands of finances, energy, and time weigh heavily. They struggle financially to provide for these grandchildren. They worry about how their grandchildren will be treated by others, or that their grandchildren's self-esteem will suffer because they're not being raised by their parents. A few illustrations. I'm 70 years old. It's so hard for me. The day from 5 to 8 seems endless. I cannot always sleep at night. I have leg cramps. With me, it's my knees, arthritis, and I think time is a factor. It's hard to find time, but I still try to take grandchild's name to the park. Not Disney, but fun places. Time is a big factor for me because I'm taking care of my father-in-law also. I'm afraid, and I don't know if this even goes on or not. Some of the other kids might realize that she don't have a mommy and daddy and ask her questions, but maybe even pick on her. I don't know. The hardest thing for me is that those kids feel like it should be a parent because their friends have parents. They have the grandparent, and it's only one grandparent. The greatest challenges? Finances, definitely, and time. And so I'm trying to paint a picture of the impact of this change in the relationship to families here. The difficult circumstances I've described are reinforced by limited options for change and pathways out of and away from this situation. Lack of basic infrastructure like broadband internet service has precluded residents even from taking online college courses or figuring out some way to break out of this cycle. In Harlan County, for example, some 20% of residents still live without a telephone. Libraries are woefully underfunded, and cell phone towers are sparse in the steep terrain. In Lee County, Mayor John Smith of Beattyville understands this human dimension of poverty. He's working toward creating opportunities that will enable his community to coexist and compete with the modern outside world. At the top of the list is internet access. Reliable internet access would open an untapped part of the economy for Beattyville residents, such as online jobs and e-commerce. He's optimistic that county-wide access will be achieved through a recent partnership between the state and the federal government in a new initiative called SOAR, Shaping Our Appalachian Region. But I'm going to comment on that in a few moments. If we now think in terms of limited options for change for older people, in the context of the fact that by and large older people at each cohort are healthier than the ones before, you'd say, well, why don't you go out and work? There's a possibility for you. Well, let's look at the options in terms of work and levels of employment. This is current material, relatively current material, moving average 2010 to 2014. Focusing specifically on older adults, options are limited in other ways. Even for those who are healthy enough and have the transportation to enable them to get to work site, the availability of employment is limited. As this summary of labor force participation rates among persons 65 or older indicates, in contrast to national and statewide trends of increasing labor force participation among the elderly, very few older adults are engaged in the labor force, particularly in the more impoverished and most rural southeastern counties, the ones where the coal is. There ain't no jobs. Okay. Finally, options for achieving future aspirations are limited. Between 2005 and 2008, I was involved in leading an initiative of the Commonwealth of Kentucky, and it was called the Kentucky Elder Readiness Initiative. A series of focus groups, 30 of them, were conducted throughout the state and in this region, and an in-depth survey was conducted of middle-aged and older adults from 9,600 families across the state. The study was designed to explore the implications for communities of the aging of the baby boom generation. People, for example, in this region who would then be moving into their baby boom old age. Among the questions explored were future aspirations and expectations. It appears that disappointment will be a motif of the future for the older residents of Eastern Kentucky. To provide only one example from many possible illustrations, data for the 5 planning districts located completely in Eastern Kentucky reveal that more than 20% of older adult and middle-aged residents anticipate that in their future they will include residents in an assisted living facility. Ha! Really? Even if they could afford this, the prospects are bleak. Very few counties in the region even have such an option, and the current economy is unlikely to stimulate the development of this alternative. This is the latest data I have from the state as of 2 days ago, and you can see the number of facilities that are going to be available for these folks in this region. But how does an entrepreneur come in and build such a facility in an economy such as that? Okay. And also, how do people pay for this themselves? Overall, the current circumstances of aging in Eastern Kentucky are challenging, and they're bleak in so many ways. So what can we do? Is there a pathway to a brighter future? Let me conclude with 3 options, and then we'll hopefully have time for some discussion of these. First option, we could abandon ship. Forget it. We've been trying for 100 years to do something. We ain't going to do it. We could abandon ship, acknowledge stark economic realities, and accept that no realistic road to a meaningful future is possible. 50 years ago, regional economist William Miernick provided this suggestion. He argued that the only pathway to a viable future was to abandon most of the plethora of small rural communities throughout Appalachia. Places like Colton, places like Beattyville, and concentrate our efforts in a few communities. While such an approach makes economic sense, it does not take into account the very human factors of people's lives, and particularly older adults, lifelong residents in their communities. It does not acknowledge the place integration that is the core of the identity of many of these older adults. So let's get rid of that one. But we could just give up. We could say, look, if you want support, you want services, leave the region. And that's why the title of his article was Needed Appalachian Ghost Towns. A second option is to persist with efforts at addressing fundamental structural, economic, and social issues that have been the focus of interventions for decades. Ever since I came to Appalachia in 1976, there's been a program followed by another program, by another program, by another program to alleviate poverty and deal with these situations. All right? Such incentives to address the problems of rural Appalachia stem right back to the time of Eleanor Roosevelt's efforts in the 1930s to address poverty through the development of communities like Arthurdale in West Virginia. They passed through the Appalachian Regional Commission's efforts over decades now, to the more recent creation of Shaping Our Appalachian Region, the SOAR initiative. SOAR is a nonpartisan development agency tasked to expand job creation, enhance regional opportunity, innovation, and identity, improve quality of life, and support all of those working to achieve these goals in Eastern Kentucky. I wonder if that could have been found somewhere, and I didn't get a chance to look back in the mandate of the Appalachian Regional Commission. Let's do it again. Let's do it again. Let's do it again. Actually, I have no qualms whatsoever with such initiatives. Indeed, they're essential. But let me conclude with another possibility that brings us back to where we started, and that I suspect will be a little controversial. Okay? When we focus on the actual lives of older adults, rural older adults, as they age, lived experience tends to become increasingly localized and to focus on home, family, and community, and particularly so in Appalachia. With advancing years, relationships with contexts intensify as individuals become more and more a part of the place where they have spent their life. As they develop and sustain a self-reinforcing sense of physical, social, and autobiographical insideness. Place becomes a part of their identity, and life tends to be tied ever more with the history and character of place as people live through its transformation. Those slides represent pictures taken from the same location in 1920, not by me, I should add, 1980, and perhaps in 2020. And I want you to look at how much has changed and how much has not changed. And I want you to look at one thing that's a consistent there. If you look very hard in 1920, right at the top here, right at the top, you can see a church. If you look in 1980, right at the top, you can see the same church. That becomes relevant in a moment. Place integration explains the very high levels of life satisfaction, morale, and well-being I encountered in Colton so many decades ago, where we were really scientific. We used 7 different measures of life satisfaction. We used the Philadelphia Geriatric Morale Scale, we used the LSIA A, version B, we used, you name it. Okay, 7 different scales. And in my naivety, the idea was that I was going to go into this region and I was going to do my documentation of how terrible and how sad things were for older adults. And so we went through the first round of having them answer all these scales. And those of you who are familiar with the region will know exactly what the response was. I was too naive at that point. They all scored off the charts. The scales were meaningless because everybody scored the same. It was all the highest level. And it's like, wait a minute, you're poor, you've got to understand, you're poor. No, they're not, okay? So, as we focus in on what's meaning for older adults, let me suggest this. Thinking small, it was apparent that well-being in Colton and the culture of aging in this place was intimately tied to places like the post office, the Colton store, the senior center, the church. In many Appalachian communities, all but the church have disappeared. How have and how do older adults accommodate their lifestyles to such change? Not looking at the statistics, looking at the lived experience of older folk in this region. I wonder if the future of aging in such communities may not be tied to the resurrection of key ways of life and place integration that existed in Colton. Some of my colleagues at the University of Kentucky are working from this perspective as they consider the potential role of churches and faith communities in sustaining and enriching the lives of older adults. And I don't mean just feeding, okay, or providing help with fixing a furnace or whatever. I mean in terms of becoming a focal of a sense of meaning in life, maintained in life, even amidst these devastating circumstances. I would contend that exploring such an approach that builds on what works so well in Colton is beyond romanticism. It's more than mere nostalgia for a world that has passed. Rather, I argue that there is rich potential for involving new methodologies, such as appreciative inquiry, participatory action research, in developing contemporary ethnographies that will allow us to understand the best of what's growing old, the best of what growing old in Appalachia has entailed, and to incorporate such an understanding in sensitive planning and policy. It's important to emphasize that this should not become an excuse for inactivity in addressing poverty on the structural level. Rather, it should be considered as a complementary option. While we figure this out, let's not just abandon the folks that are in this situation right now, today, as we sit in this room. At the outset of this presentation, I noted that my engagement in aging in Appalachia has been on and off basis for the last 4 decades. Preparing for this presentation has inspired me to engage in the next stage of my sojourn, a return to the mountains, to revisit some of the themes I identified in the 1980s in the context of how they may be manifest in the new realities of the region that I tried to share with you today. Thank you. So it's time for questions. Is there time for questions? No, it's okay. So there is time for questions. And I didn't. Comments, questions? Yes.
Could you flesh out a little bit how your third option would work? I think it sounds good. I'm just not sure I completely visualize it.
Me too. Okay, I'm not sure. But let's think about it. How might that work? Okay. See, the problem is there's an immediate reaction against that kind of option that says, wait a minute, that's just an excuse. We're using that as an excuse for not doing anything about the real objective poverty that exists. But in a sense, that's the whole problem that we're dealing with. As researchers and scholars and planners and administrators, we look at poverty in terms of measures like the income levels that people have. But then when we look closer, okay, and you look down, which is what we've not been doing lately, okay, we've been looking at lots of statistics and lots of tragedy stories and lots of things like this, but we haven't been looking at what actually people actually do. So when I looked, before presenting this, I thought, okay, I'll just go and find some latest ethnographies and people are understanding what's it like to experience this. There ain't nothing there, okay? So I'm sort of posing this at the end as a question. So what might this be like? How might we move forward with this? Well, Nancy Schoenberg, who's an eminent person at UK, has federal funding and has been working with churches and looking at the way in which churches may be able to help us that become a focal point that such that the senior center, which is disappearing, and the other places are disappearing for doing things. There's another group of people who are looking at the possibility of some kind of gardening initiatives, cooperatives among people working, very small scale. Some people would say, well, hokey, it's not spectacular, it doesn't require millions of dollars. Well, maybe that's what will make it work, that in fact that it doesn't require that. But to answer your question, which is a fantastic question, is I don't really know. And so that's one of the reasons why I've already sort of arranged to sort of go back, not to Colton, but actually probably to Beattyville and some other places this summer, and get the stories that we don't have. Yeah, we have the stories that are in the newspaper of the drug-obsessed grandmother and all of those kinds of issues. But how do the rest of the older adults, the people, function? How do they cope? How do they adjust to this? Do they maintain high levels of well-being in the face of this? And what, from their point of view, okay, could we do that would help things? So that's why I mentioned at the end appreciative inquiry. Appreciative inquiry is basically, instead of looking at problems, you basically, how many of you are familiar with that? Heard of it? Okay, essentially it's an approach to research that basically says, instead of going and saying, okay, tell us about your poverty problems here, you start saying, let's start by talking about what's good about your life. And so it's a whole strategy and philosophy of research that is really asking people to build on what is good. And what was good in Colton was the relationships and the obligations and the mutual responsibility that people held, that uplifted them and made them feel well. So what if we started that and we went into Beattyville and places and say, okay, what's good about your life that we could build on? If there are any redeeming features of this that we can build on. The second thing, which is a problem that University of Kentucky's had and many places who have gone in to help folks in Appalachia, is that really we are not the people to define what the issues are and what needs to be done. The people themselves are. They understand what's going on there. And that's where the whole new trend towards participatory action research becomes really important. So let's just go in there and lay our hands on folks there. We have a new solution for you. Okay? Let's kind of go in and actually listen, maybe, and maybe assume that these folks in Colton, they had it figured out. Very poor. They figured it out. They had good lives. They said, things are great here. And I wanted to say to them, yeah, but you're really poor. Okay? And so any of you who are familiar with Paulo Freire would know that one of the strategies that Paulo Freire would argue is you have to make people aware of, you have to make them conscious of the oppression on them. Okay? Well, do you? Yeah, because that's what we need to do. Okay, so then you make everybody unhappy because we can't do anything about it. We just have to make you aware of how bad things are. So the strategy, I'm sort of extending your answer here, but in a question here. So the strategy is to basically be a little bit humble and to give the possibility that there are options in there with people who have lived there their whole lives, who understand the community, and not just skim the surface. I haven't given you a complete answer here, because if I had a complete blueprint, I would be writing federal grants to try and get money to do it, I suspect. No, actually, I probably wouldn't, because that may be the problem. But, okay, is it a partial? I can't answer. Okay. You were looking for answers. I'm not a policy nugget person. I am so sorry. I'm sorry. I'm a question or touchy-feely kind of person on this too. So But it's a really good question. You say, okay, Graham, great idea. How do we do it? What do we do? What do I tell my legislator now that we need to do? I don't know yet because I haven't talked to those folks recently. Okay, thank you. Yes, hi.
You said that earlier, a lot of folks aged in place.
Yes.
Could you update that? Is that still going on, or do you have sort of a kind of a salmon effect in which the elderly of kids who are doing okay have moved into Louisville, can have moved them out? Are you looking at a subset of the population that really has been kind of disadvantaged in multiple ways?
Yeah, we did. I didn't include anything in this talk about this too, but we did some work, 3 grants from the Appalachian Region Commission, that was looking at return migration and migration in rural Appalachian communities. And basically the mandate was to say, is it possible that the attraction of elderly retirees would be a path to economic development? And so we looked at Hazard, Kentucky, we looked at Hendersonville, North Carolina, we looked at Somerset, Kentucky as places, and we spent some time there. We made a film, we did a whole bunch of stuff in relation to this. And it basically looking at what's going on with the aging of the population there and the potential for growth. And linking directly back to your question right now, the question, what we found was that the populations there are very different. And that in some communities you have conflict among different groups of older adults. So you have the people who are aging in place. So take Somerset, Kentucky. You have the people who are aging in place there, okay? And they've grown up and they've grown old there and they're involved in this community. And essentially they have a particular set of values and expectations. But then you have the Ohio Navy, okay? It's a lake area. There's lakes, Lake Cumberland, other lakes. And essentially locally they call them the Ohio Navy. And those are the people from Ohio who have the boats. And they come down in the weekends, okay? And they put their boats in the water and they go back again. The Navy goes north again at the end of the weekend. Well, what happens is that eventually those folks say, well, Mabel, living north in Ohio, living in, nobody from Dayton, is there? Okay. Well, okay, I'm going to offend you probably. But living in Dayton is not as good as what it is down on the lake. And so what they do is they move down and they move into this rural community. And of course they have Dayton expectations. And so they expect the road to be fixed when it ain't ever been fixed before. And they come into conflict because they are not very interested in economic development. Because the reason they came down was to enjoy the beauty of the lake. Right. Whereas the local folks, they want jobs. Okay? So they want fruit of the loom, specifically fruit of the loom in the case, okay, to come in and give some jobs. But you coming down from Ohio don't want that. Okay? And then you have a third group, at least in eastern Kentucky, that's really interesting. And those are people who left a generation ago. And they left when they were young, and they got jobs in Dayton, and they got jobs in Cincinnati and so on. And they have decided to retire home back to the mountains. Okay? So now you look at it, and thinking of the situation that you talked about, you have a situation where it becomes very complicated, because not only do you have these old people who aged in place, you have these other people with different expectations. So they do expect to have assisted living down the line on this. They do expect some investment in the community and such. So it becomes very complicated as you try and tease out this in the relationship among these different groups. Does that begin to address your question? Okay, yeah.
So if you were to go back in 2020 to
Yeah.
Holton, what do you think, or what do you hypothesize would be the quality of life measures today? So they would have been in their 20s, right? The last time we were there in 1980.
Yeah.
So now is there...
Well, actually, it's interesting the kind of research I did. I actually rented from somebody who was 20, who was the grandson of one of the participants in my study.
Right.
Talk about contamination of a study. But
So now they're all grown up, right? So now
right.
they're little kids.
And actually, Chuck Plum actually became the mayor. The last time I was back there, he was the mayor, and he was a 20-year-old kid before. But you know, if you're a mayor of a place of 300 people, it's like you're mayor by default. Nobody else would do it. That kind of thing. So it's not like the great honor. We now present you the mayor and stuff. So the question was, what would this be? What's the picture going to look like if we go back here? I don't know. One of the things I could tell you is that the post office is gone. It went a while ago. Pardon? Yes, the church is still there. The church is still there, yeah. And actually, if you look, when I was doing the field research here, see this building? This building here, it's the old bank. and it's still here, and that's where we stayed, my wife and I, when we were, it was an old abandoned bank, and any of you know what sulfur is in water? Okay, it was kind of interesting. Anyway, that's sort of rambling a little bit, but so the question is, what do I expect things to be like then?
What do you think it would be like now for older adults living there? Do you
In
think
2020?
Yeah,
I don't know,
yeah.
but this is what we're creating. I mean, this is what we're creating. This is what your policy is going to help us do, supposedly. Okay, right? Okay. I don't know. But so one of the things that I'm concerned about is that we just focus on initiatives like ARC and like SOAR and everything, and they're great and they're really good. There's nothing negative about them. I have nothing negative to say about them. But maybe we're missing some other way of making life richer for those folks. Because if you go back to William Miernick, okay, you say, well, it ain't going to matter because they'll be dead, that generation. So we got the new generation now, and think about it. Here's a possibility. Okay, the new generation, the younger generation, particularly if we get internet access in the area, okay, they're savvy internet and so on. And so maybe we have an economy that's less place-based. And so maybe instead of creating coal jobs, and by the way, coal is not coming back. I'm sorry, it ain't coming back, period. It's gone. Okay, so instead of saying, oh, we're going to bring the coal jobs back, the answer is not, and that would be the worst thing you could possibly do. What we need to do is to look in this region in terms of what we can do to build a viable economy within those folks. And I think that's what the people at SOAR and other people are trying to do. But we've been trying for decades and decades and decades, and there's been some cultural resistance to that. That's not an answer, I'm sorry. Do you have a suggestion of what
No,
might look
I
like?
don't. It's a complicated one, because at what point do you keep trying to offer help?
Right.
do
And at
we
what point
really
do you
want
take? And at what point do you take a bunch of bulldozers, and in 2020, this is a nice, pristine hillside, and all the people who are old there have gone, and they're living in Lexington or living in other areas. Probably against. Well. Okay. Sorry. Other questions? Hi.
I really appreciate your emphasis on shared experience and identifying the heartfelt mission of the citizens as a solution. And I was thinking about Solveig's question because I'm a social work major too, and thinking about the opposite of the first option of abandoning ship, the exact opposite in my mind of like what would be like some sort of like lifelong learning experience. It just reminds, kind of thinking of like policy, like it would be really neat to see something like some sort of funding towards a furthering education program for the elderly population, just as, I don't know, that's just like where my brain went with it.
Okay. So furthering education. I'm a great believer in furthering education for anybody. Okay. But in terms of what would that do? Are you talking about? See, we have a problem here. We have a generational problem. So we introduce a policy, and it's actually not a policy that affects old people now. Because by the time it's introduced, those people have either died or moved on. And so what you're dealing with is policy for people who are now in their 40s and 50s. Okay. And so what you do for that was something that prepares them for then when they're older. Okay. So you educate them, I guess. Is that what you're suggesting? You provide.
Yeah, and not, I mean not in a broad sense of kind of with going back to your idea of like identifying what their heartfelt mission is, what their quality of life, what they
want.
What
Yes.
they want.
Yes.
And basing off and furthering education based on what those aspects would be. I'm not talking about like this college experience.
No. It's
Yeah.
okay.
But even like basic, like, cooking workshops, like taking it as
Yeah,
basic
yeah,
as that
yeah.
to making it as something as major as like the college
Yeah.
experience. Somewhere in between where you were to take those
Yeah.
like quality of life aspects and implementing those kind of things in these sorts of areas.
But you're providing options and opportunities in regards to this. It's interesting because I think, let me take you back to 1980. One of the women I worked with, her name was Lucinda. In fact, you show the graph of her walking around. She had 11 children. And one of the things that was amazing about her, she had a heart condition, she had other things. I don't know where she got it from. She was a voracious reader. And it was like, well, she should be sitting by the hearth quilting or something. But actually, she was a voracious reader, a very, very smart person, and was not what you'd expect to find in this area. And so I think what you're touching on is something really important. We have these stereotypes of what an old person living in rural Appalachia is like. And it's like any other group of people. It's an incredibly diverse group. And I think what you're suggesting is there other ways that we can provide broader sets of options to allow people to participate on their own terms as a way to reviving a sense of community and identity there. You know, that becomes part of the strategy. But it's not clean. It's not like getting a grant from the feds and going in and imposing some program on and then evaluating it later and finding out that it doesn't work. Okay, it's really sort of grassroots, and I think that's what you're thinking, right? Sort of, how do we stimulate that? How do we give people hope? The most dominant image that I had, okay, as I was preparing for this talk, was from Nancy Schoenberg, who is a very respected person. I respect her a lot. She's a Marion Pearson Endowed Professor in behavioral science there, who has grant money coming out of everywhere. Okay, and I talked to her about it because I said, I'm giving this talk. Can you summarize things for me? How would I summarize this? And she said, as never before, hopelessness and despair. And it was a very sobering way for me to end my interaction with her when we were talking about data and so on. But she's out there in those communities, and that's the attitude, that's the aura. Okay. And the question becomes, how do we change that? And you know, I don't know. I don't have the answer. And so the suggestion that you have is a possibility. How do we tease that out? And how would we do it? How would we make it practical? How would we pilot it in a single community and find it grow? Maybe. You know, yeah. So I've taken too much of your time already. So is there any other? Anybody got a solution that I could make a bunch of money off selling? Okay. Thank you so much for your attention. Really appreciate it.